Hi, everybody. I just finished the book Four Mountains by Michael Neibauer. This was published recently by Lexham Press, and I want to say thank you to Lexham for sending me a review copy. This is my honest reaction to the book. I'll take you through my typical format of the main idea of the book, the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then I'll give some general reactions at the very end. If that's the main thing you're interested in, just jump ahead to that. But this is my typical format that I try to take people through to give you a full kind of sense of what's going on in this book and whether or not this might be a good fit for you to spend some time with. So let's jump into this one. Four Mountains is ostensibly a biblical theology, kind of narrative literary theology, and it is, by its title and by its presentation, it presents as being organized around four mountains that take you through the biblical big narrative, the meta-narrative, so to speak. Those four mountains are Eden, Sinai, Tabor is the mountain of Christ, the mount of the Transfiguration, and then Zion, which is kind of the culmination, the eschatological kind of culmination mountain. I say it's ostensibly about that because there's actually a lot more going on. I kind of expected this to be one of those fairly straightforward presentations of here's how to read the narrative of the literature of scriptures, and here's how to think of it. Here are four mountains to kind of give you handles to grasp that literature, almost like four acts or four chapters, four movements. There are lots of books that kind of cover the biblical story in different ways, and I thought this would be a presentation of kind of one way to think about the biblical story. And it is about that, and the book is organized around those four mountains, but there's actually a lot more going on, and that's one of the things I want to emphasize in this review, is that there's more going on in this book than might seem at first glance, or certainly by the cover. And what this book, I would say, actually is about is much more about how to read the Bible through the symbols of the story and the many stories that compose the literature. So reading and noticing symbols like fire, like oil, water, trumpets, swords, these kinds of images that evoke, that are motifs, that make up motifs and have a symbolic meaning that carry through the entirety of the literature in the scriptural canon. It's actually a lot more about that than it is about these particular mountains. The mountains are the structural kind of organization of the book, and it does move chronologically through them, and he does make arguments for why those particular mountains at that particular time and all of that. But I would say that the Four Mountains idea is really not how I would foreground what the book is actually about. I would say the book is actually an introduction to reading the Bible and noticing its symbols and its symbolic elements throughout the entire scripture. Very much like how ancient patristic church fathers read the scriptures. It's kind of an orientation or an introduction to that way of seeing the scriptural narrative symbolically. So I almost wish the book had been called something other than Four Mountains. I wish it had been called something like, or at least the subtitle was something like, paying attention to the symbology of the scriptures, or something like that. But so that's what I'd say the main idea is. It's kind of presents as this biblical theology with this four mountain framework, but it's actually much more of a guide through here's how to notice symbols, here's what some of the symbols might mean, here's what it means when they repeat, here's what it gestures to when they show up in these different stories, and so on and so forth. So that's what Four Mountains by Michael Neibauer is about. Now the research behind it, I was pleasantly surprised in a certain way by the research, in that it's largely patristics. Most, if not, I didn't number all of the citation and the quotes, but by gut reading, by kind of my gut reaction, I would say 75 to 80% of the citations and quotations are from 6th century and earlier church fathers, which was a really pleasant surprise to me. Usually, I'm used to biblical theologies and narrative theologies like this pulling on much more recent sources, and so as someone who loves the patristics and I love being immersed in that way of writing and thinking, I was really, really pleasantly surprised to see that he is primarily pulling on the patristic sources here. And I would say that one of the strengths of this book is that it is kind of an intro to the patristics. It's kind of almost a sneaky intro to the patristics in that that's not how it presents, and you don't think you're picking up a textbook that's reading scripture with the church fathers, but effectively as you read it, that's actually what you are doing, and he kind of gets at it at a slant and introduces the reader into that way of reading, which is really nice. Now, and that leads me to the readability of the style. This is a very easy to read book. I would put this almost in a devotional style of writing. It's very accessible, very approachable. I would give this to somebody, and depending on where you're coming from as a reader, this might be a strength. If I would give this to somebody who has no orientation to Irenaeus or Augustine or Athanasius, name the Cappadocians, name any of them. Someone who's never read any of them could read this book and could appreciate it, and I think would enjoy it because of that inviting style. It's very, very easy to read. Almost too introductory if you are someone who likes the patristics and is already well versed in them and already is comfortable with that more symbolic reading of scripture. And that will I'll recap that in my reaction thoughts at the end here, which is what I'll get into now. I'm genuinely a bit mixed on this personally for me. Genuinely mixed, genuinely positive, and genuinely a little negative or disappointed or confused. So I'll walk through both sides of that briefly. First of all, the positive things that I've already mentioned. I really like that it's sourced in the patristic writings. I also really like the narrative interpretive approach. I've said that in other reviews. If you followed any of my videos for some time, that will not be a surprise to you. I love the narrative literature approach towards understanding what scriptures are saying and teaching. I love all of that. I like that this book takes that approach. I like the four mountains as a kind of almost a mnemonic device to remember the shape of the scriptural narrative. I like the embrace of the symbolic interpretation of scripture. I like all of that stuff. I like that it's almost this subversive, sneaky introduction to that way of reading for someone who might find it. I'm familiar with certain evangelical cultures that are very wary of over allegorizing everything and approaching everything as symbolic, and they feel like that's playing fast and loose with biblical interpretation. This book is kind of a pushback on all of that way of thinking, and I like all of that. So I like all of that. I want to say that. My genuine mixed kind of reaction then on the other side of the coin is that, first of all, what I said at the beginning, that I feel like this book isn't what you think it's going to be when you get into it, which was a little bit of a wrinkle for me. It's also very casual devotional in tone and style, which for me, I don't want to denigrate that just full stop. I think that's really good for some people. It just wasn't what I was expecting to be for me, and my interest in the book was pitched more towards a slightly more academic or deeper dive into some of the symbolic interpretations, and so I just didn't get that, and so I left with feeling a little disappointed by that. I will also say I have a bit of a more positive reaction to the first half of the book than the second half. The first two mountains were more as Old Testament focused. I love the symbolic interpretations there. I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff that he does when he talks about olive oil, and he talks about the symbology of sword, even when swords and spears show up in different ways in different stories. I liked that section of the book more, and I found that more kind of stimulating and reflective. The second half, interestingly, when he gets into the narrative of Jesus and he gets into then Mount Zion at the end, I felt like it pivoted even more into the devotional application, pastoral application kind of mode, rather than the more, to my view, interesting artistic literary narrative interpretation mode. And it felt like there was a bit of a turn that just left me feeling like I wanted more of the richer symbolic interpretation equally through the second half of the book than the first half. And so that leads me toward my mixed takeaways from this. And that all said, I'm just going to land this review with I don't always do this with these reviews, but I would give a pretty clear delineation of my recommendations on this book. I think if you're someone who's never really read the patristics, if the idea of symbolic and more allegorical interpretation is very foreign to you, but you're interested in that, I think this is an awesome intro. Or if you know of someone who maybe would be allergic to that way of thinking, but could use like an inviting and a winsome and a gentle, easy read to start thinking that way, get this book for them. That's my biggest recommendation for this. But if you're a little bit more like my reading habits and you've read a good bit of the patristics, you've already done some deeper dives, and you're comfortable with that more symbolic take. You've already seen some of the bigger meta-narrative literary interpretations of scripture. If you're swimming in those waters already, I don't think this one's going to move the needle much for you or give you anything really new to think about, and you might, like me, walk away a little disappointed by the casual intro kind of level of reading that it is. So part of my hope for this review is to really tailor expectations correctly to what this book is, because I think it's great for some people, but will be potentially disappointing for others, especially because of the confusing way that it potentially is pitched, and you might be surprised at what you're getting into when you pick it up. So those are my thoughts on Four Mountains. I appreciate what the book is doing. I'm very much in line with the philosophy of the book, and I want the people for whom this book will be beneficial, I want them to read it, even if it's not necessarily something I will personally revisit or would recommend to people who have done more deeper dives already. So I hope that makes some sense. I hope my talking through that has helped you figure out whether you might want to actually spend some time with this book. So thank you again to Lexham Press for sending me a review copy. Thank you to Michael Neibauer for writing it. And thank you for taking a few minutes to watch.